The hammer struck the anvil with a rhythmic precision that had become second nature to after 23 years of blacksmithing. Each blow sent sparks dancing through the dim workshop, illuminating the weathered face of a man who had chosen to remain on Earth while the rest of humanity reached for the stars. The Galactic Council had made first contact 30 years ago, offering humanity a place among the civilized species of the galaxy. Most had jumped at the chance to explore new worlds, to trade with alien civilizations, to become part of something greater, but had stayed behind, one of perhaps 1,000 humans who preferred the familiar weight of iron and steel to the promise of quantum drives and energy weapons. The mining station orbiting 442b was supposed to be fully automated. The corporation had assured the Galactic Council that their extraction operations required no sentient oversight, just efficient machines pulling rare metals from dead worlds. What they hadn't mentioned was the creature they had found sleeping in the planet's core. The dragon was unlike anything in the galactic databases. Its scales shimmered with an opalescent quality that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When the mining lasers first pierced the planetary crust, they had awakened something that had been dormant for. The creature's roar had shattered mining equipment across 3 continents and sent seismic waves through space that registered on instruments light years away. They had acted quickly. Using neural suppressors and gravitational restraints, they had captured the beast before it could fully emerge from its slumber. The dragon found itself bound by chains forged from, held in a crystalline prison that fed on its own bioelectric field to maintain its containment. Every struggle only made the bonds, every roar only strengthened the walls of its cage. For 15 years, the dragon had been the most prized possession. They displayed it at their corporate headquarters, a living symbol of their dominance over the natural world. Investors marveled at the creature's beauty while scientists probed its biology, searching for secrets that might unlock new technologies. The dragon's tears, they discovered, could power a starship for decades. Its shed scales were harder than any known material. Its blood, when properly processed, could extend the of most galactic species by centuries. They grew wealthy beyond measure, and the dragon grew weaker with each passing year. Knew none of this as he worked in his shop on the outskirts of what had once been Denver. The city had been largely abandoned when the Great Exodus began, leaving behind empty skyscrapers and the stubborn few who refused to join the galactic community. He had inherited the blacksmith shop from his grandfather, who had inherited it from his grandfather before him. 4 generations of the family had worked this forge and had no intention of being the last. The message came through his old communication terminal just as he was banking the fires for the evening. The device crackled to life, its screen flickering with interference from the orbital traffic that still passed overhead. A face appeared, weathered and tired, belonging to a woman he recognized as Sarah Martinez, one of the few humans who had made a name for themselves in galactic trade. She said, her voice distorted by the long-distance transmission, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need your help." Wiped his hands on his leather apron and leaned closer to the screen. He hadn't spoken to Sarah in over a decade, not since she had left Earth to join a merchant fleet operating in the Outer Rim territories. "What kind of help?" he asked. Sarah's expression grew serious. "There's something they have been hiding from the Galactic Council, a prisoner. They've been torturing it for years, using it as a source of exotic materials. I've seen the files. It's not like anything we've encountered before." "What does this have to do with me?" asked, though he had a feeling he already knew where this was going. "The creature is bound by chains," Sarah said. "Chains that even our most advanced plasma cutters can't break, but the files mention something else. The chains have a weak point, a joint that was forged rather than molecularly bonded. They're held together by what they call primitive metallurgy." Felt his heart skip a beat. "You're talking about traditional blacksmithing." "They don't understand it," Sarah continued. "To them, hammering hot metal is an obsolete practice. They don't realize that a skilled blacksmith can see weaknesses in forged joints that their scanners miss. They don't understand that sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones." "Sarah, what you're describing sounds like a suicide mission. Even if I could somehow break these chains, getting to wherever they're keeping this creature would be impossible." "Not impossible," Sarah said, and could see the hint of a smile on her weathered face. "I have a ship and I have a crew that owes me favors. We can get you to the station. The question is, are you willing to help?" Looked around his workshop, at the tools his grandfather had taught him to use, at the forge that had been the heart of his family for generations. He thought about the empty city outside, about the handful of humans who had chosen to stay behind while their species joined the galactic community. "Tell me more about this creature," he said finally. Sarah's expression grew distant. "The files call it a dragon, though that's probably just the closest translation they could manage. It's ancient, older than human civilization, maybe older than most of the species in the galaxy. They found it sleeping in the core of a dead world, and they've been bleeding it dry ever since." "Why do you care?" asked. "You've been trading with these aliens for years. Why risk everything for one creature?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Because 15 years ago, when I first saw the footage of what they were doing to it, I heard something in its voice that I recognized. Pain, yes, but also intelligence. This isn't just some mindless beast, it's a sentient being, and it's been tortured for decades while the galaxy turns a blind eye." Nodded slowly. He understood the weight of tradition, the importance of preserving something ancient in a universe that seemed to value only the new and efficient. If this creature was truly as old as Sarah claimed, then it represented something precious that was being destroyed for profit. "When do we leave?" he asked. The journey to the station took 3 weeks aboard Sarah's modified freight hauler, the Iron Horse. The ship was a hybrid of human and alien technology, its hull reinforced with Terran steel, but its engines powered by exotic matter drives that could bend spacetime. Spent most of the trip in the cargo hold, setting up a portable forge and studying the technical specifications that Sarah had managed to acquire. The chains were indeed impressive. Each link was forged from matter so dense that a handful would weigh more than a mountain. The gravitational fields they generated helped maintain the dragon's prison, creating a localized distortion that made escape impossible. But Sarah had been right about the weak points. The chains were held together by traditional rivets and joints, metalwork that followed principles had learned as an apprentice. "They are engineers, not craftsmen," he explained to Sarah as they reviewed the schematics. "They understand the molecular structure of metals, but they don't understand how stress flows through forged joints. This rivet here," he pointed to a junction between two massive chain links, "it's perfectly functional, but it was made by someone who didn't understand the grain structure of the metal." "Can you break it?" Sarah asked. "With the right tools and enough time, yes, but it won't be quiet and it won't be quick. The moment I start working on those chains, every alarm on that station is going to go off." Sarah nodded grimly. "We'll handle the security, you just focus on freeing the dragon." The corporate station was a massive structure that hung in the shadow of 442B like a metallic moon. Its crystalline architecture reflected the light of the system's twin suns, creating rainbow patterns that danced across its surface. From the outside, it looked like a work of art. Tried not to think about what was happening inside. Sarah's crew had been planning this operation for months. They knew the station's security protocols, its guard rotations, the blind spots in its sensor networks. Getting inside would require precision timing and no small amount of luck. "The dragon is being held in the central containment facility," Sarah explained as they approached the station. "It's in the heart of the structure, surrounded by multiple layers of security. We'll create a distraction in the outer sections while you make your way to the core." Checked his equipment one final time. He carried a compact plasma forge, molecular hammers, and a toolkit that represented centuries of human metallurgy knowledge. It wasn't much compared to the advanced technology surrounding them, but it would have to be enough. "Remember," Sarah said as they reached the docking bay, "once those alarms start, we'll have maybe 30 minutes before security forces arrive. If you can't break the chains in that time." "Then we're all dead," finished. "I understand." The infiltration went smoothly at first. Sarah's crew had done their homework, and the diversionary explosions in the station's outer ring drew most of the security forces away from the central areas. Made his way through gleaming corridors that hummed with alien technology, following the route they had memorized during weeks of planning. The first sign that something was wrong came when he reached the containment facility's outer perimeter. The area was supposed to be lightly guarded, but found himself facing a security checkpoint that hadn't appeared on any of their intelligence reports. 2 guards stood at attention, their forms covered in biomechanical armor that gleamed with built-in weapons systems. Crouched behind a support pillar and activated his communicator. "Sarah, we have a problem. There's additional security at the containment facility." "We're already engaged with security forces in 3 other sections," came Sarah's voice, crackling with static. "You're on your own, find another way in." Studied the checkpoint for several minutes, watching the guards patrol patterns. There were methodical creatures, following precise routines with mechanical efficiency. But that efficiency was also a weakness. Like their metallurgy, their security protocols were rigid and predictable. He waited until both guards had turned their backs during their synchronized patrol, then sprinted across the open space toward a maintenance hatch he had spotted on the far wall. His heart hammered in his chest as he worked to override the access controls, expecting at any moment to hear the buzz of energy weapons charging behind him. The hatch opened with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the main security perimeter. Squeezed through the opening and began crawling toward the heart of the station, guided by the building schematics he had memorized. 20 minutes later, he emerged into the central containment facility and saw the dragon for the first time. The creature was magnificent and terrible, its massive form suspended in the center of a crystalline chamber that pulsed with energy. The dragon's scales shifted color as watched, cycling through deep purples and blues that seemed to contain entire galaxies. Its eyes were closed, but could see the intelligence behind those ancient lids, the consciousness that they had been exploiting for decades. The chains were even more impressive in person. Each link was the size of a small building, held together by joints that generated their own gravitational fields. The chains wrapped around the dragon's limbs and neck, connecting to anchor points embedded in the chamber walls. Energy flowed through the metal in visible patterns, feeding the dragon's own bioelectric field back into the containment system. Approached the nearest anchor point and began examining the joint structure. Up close, he could see exactly what Sarah had meant about primitive metallurgy. They had used advanced molecular bonding for most of the chain links, but the critical junctions had been forged using traditional techniques. The aliens had probably contracted the work out to a less advanced species, not understanding that the old methods would create weak points in their perfect prison. He set up his portable forge and began heating his molecular hammers, tools that could operate at the quantum level while maintaining the precise control that traditional blacksmithing required. The work was delicate and dangerous. One wrong strike could destabilize the entire chain, possibly killing both him and the dragon. As began his work, striking carefully at the stressed metal of the first joint, the dragon's eyes slowly opened. The creature's gaze was ancient and intelligent, filled with pain but also with something hadn't expected: hope. The dragon's voice reached him not through sound, but through direct contact with his mind, a form of communication that transcended language barriers. "You are different from the others." The voice was like the rumble of distant thunder, carrying harmonics that spoke of ages beyond human comprehension. "You work with tools of metal and flame, yet you are not like the metal shapers who forged these bonds." "I'm human," replied, not sure if his thoughts would reach the creature. "I'm here to free you." "Human," the dragon repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, I have heard whispers of your kind. A young species, barely emerged from your birth world. Yet here you stand in the heart of my prison, wielding tools that the ancient ones would have recognized." Continued his work, each strike of the hammer calculated to stress the joint in exactly the right way. It was incredibly dense, but like all forged metals, it had a grain structure that could be exploited by someone who understood the principles of traditional metallurgy. "The metal shapers believe that precision and perfection are the highest virtues," the dragon continued. "They do not understand that sometimes imperfection creates strength. Your ancestors knew this, as did mine." "How long have you been imprisoned?" asked as he worked. 15 of your years, though time moves strangely in this place. I was ancient when your species first looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond them. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched young species discover fire and older ones transcend physical existence. But I have never seen anything quite like what you are doing." The first joint finally gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. The massive chain link crashed to the floor, and immediately the dragon's form seemed to solidify, becoming more real and present in the chamber. But there were still 5 more anchor points to break, and could hear alarms beginning to wail throughout the station. "You must hurry," the dragon said. "The metal shapers will not allow me to escape again." Moved to the second anchor point, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was what he had been born to do, he realized. Not just the blacksmithing, but this moment. His family had preserved ancient traditions not just for the sake of history, but for this exact situation. Sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked. As he began heating the second joint, could hear the sound of running feet in the corridors outside. Sarah's diversions were wearing thin, and it wouldn't be long before they traced the alarm to its source. He had perhaps 10 minutes to break 5 more joints, each one requiring several minutes of careful work. "Tell me about yourself," the dragon said, and realized the creature was trying to distract him from the mounting pressure. "What drives a member of such a young species to risk everything for a stranger?" "My grandfather always said that metalworking was about more than shaping iron," replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked. "He said it was about understanding that everything has a breaking point, but also that everything can be repaired if you know how to work with its nature instead of against it." The second joint cracked, then shattered. The dragon's left wing was now free, and the creature flexed it experimentally, sending waves of energy through the chamber. The containment field flickered but held. "Your grandfather was wise," the dragon said. "The metal shapers never learned this lesson. They believe that sufficient force can overcome any obstacle, that perfection can be achieved through precision alone. They do not understand that true strength comes from accepting and working with imperfection." Moved to the third anchor point, knowing that time was running out. The sounds outside were getting closer, and he could hear the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging. Sarah's team was fighting a running battle through the station's corridors, but they couldn't hold off the security forces indefinitely. "What will you do when you're free?" asked, partly to keep the dragon talking and partly because he was genuinely curious. "I will remember," the dragon replied simply. "I will remember the young human who chose to preserve ancient ways in a galaxy obsessed with the new. I will remember the courage it took to enter this place with nothing but metal and flame, and I will ensure that others remember as well." The third joint broke just as the containment facility's main doors exploded inward. Security forces poured into the chamber, their weapons trained on and his forge. The lead officer, distinguished by the additional biomechanical augmentations covering his carapace, stepped forward with the confident stride of someone used to being obeyed. "Step away from the prisoner, human," the officer commanded in accented standard Galactic. "You are interfering with lawful corporate operations." Didn't stop working. He moved to the fourth anchor point and began heating his hammers, even as energy weapons hummed to life around him. "There's nothing lawful about torturing a sentient being for profit. The creature is classified as a non-sapient biological resource," the officer replied. "It has no rights under galactic law." "Then galactic law is wrong," said simply, and brought his hammer down on the fourth joint. They opened fire, but their energy beams struck an invisible barrier that surrounded his work area. The dragon had extended its own defensive fields, protecting the human who was working to free it. The barrier flashed and sparked under the assault, but held firm. "Impossible," the officer hissed. "The neural suppressors should prevent any use of its abilities." "You never understood what you captured," the dragon's voice boomed through the chamber, no longer confined to telepathic communication. "I am not merely a creature of flesh and scale. I am given form, thought made manifest. Your machines can bind my body, but they cannot contain what I truly am." The fourth joint shattered, and now only 2 anchor points remained. The dragon's form was becoming more solid with each broken chain, its presence filling the chamber with an almost tangible sense of ancient power. The weapons continued to fire, but their beams seemed to bend around the barrier, unable to reach their target. Worked faster now, his movements taking on the rhythm of generations of blacksmiths before him. Each strike of the hammer was precise, calculated, part of a tradition that stretched back to the first human who had learned to shape metal with fire and will. They had superior technology, but they had no answer for this ancient knowledge passed down through bloodlines and guild halls. "You cannot do this," the officer shouted over the sound of energy weapons and ringing metal. "The resources this creature provides are essential to galactic commerce. Thousands of worlds depend on the materials we harvest from it." "Then thousands of worlds are built on slavery," replied, breaking the fifth joint. Only 1 anchor point remained, and the dragon's power was growing with each moment of freedom. The containment field was failing, energy patterns disrupting as the creature's own bioelectric field overwhelmed the systems designed to contain it. Please, the officer said, and for the first time there was desperation in his voice. You don't understand what you're doing. This creature is older than most civilizations. If it's freed, it could destroy everything we've built. Paused in his work and looked at the dragon. The creature's ancient eyes met his, and he saw no malice there, only intelligence and a deep weariness that came from centuries of captivity. Will you, asked quietly, destroy what they've built? I am not interested in destruction, the dragon replied. I am interested in balance. For too long, this galaxy has valued efficiency over wisdom, progress over preservation. Perhaps it is time for the ancient ways to have a voice again. Nodded and turned back to the final anchor point. This joint was the largest and most complex, designed to bear the greatest stress if the dragon ever tried to break free through brute force. But like all the others, it had been forged rather than molecularly bonded, and could see the stress patterns in the metal that revealed its weakness. He raised his hammer for the final strike, knowing that once this chain was broken, everything would change. The dragon would be free, and there would be consequences that rippled across the galaxy. But sometimes change was necessary, even when it was dangerous. Wait, came a new voice from behind the security forces. A human woman strode into the chamber, her clothing marking her as a representative of the Galactic Council. I am Counselor Elizabeth Stone, speaking for the Human Assembly. By the authority of the Galactic Accords, I order you to stand down. The officer turned to face her, his compound eyes glittering with anger. This is a corporate facility operating under valid extraction licenses. The Council has no authority here. The Council has every authority when it comes to the treatment of sapient beings, Stone replied calmly. And our preliminary scans confirm that this creature exhibits clear signs of intelligence and self-awareness. Its continued imprisonment constitutes a violation of the Sapient Rights Conventions. You have no proof of sapience, the officer protested. Actually, we do, Stone said, producing a small recording device. Our agent has been monitoring the creature's communications for the past several minutes. Its conversations with the human blacksmith clearly demonstrate not only intelligence, but wisdom, historical knowledge, and complex emotional responses. By any legal definition, this is a sapient being that has been held against its will. Looked at Sarah, who had appeared behind the counselor along with several other humans in official council uniforms. His friend smiled and gave him a small nod. This had been planned from the beginning, he realized. The rescue mission had been as much about gathering evidence as it had been about freeing the dragon. Furthermore, Stone continued, our investigation has revealed that corporation has been operating these extraction facilities without proper oversight for over a decade. The materials harvested from this creature have been sold throughout the galaxy without any disclosure of their origin. This represents fraud on a massive scale. The security officer's carapace clicked with agitation. These accusations are supported by complete documentation, Stone interrupted, including corporate communications detailing the creature's capture, the suppression of its sapient status, and the deliberate concealment of its suffering from galactic authorities. Raised his hammer again. So do I finish this, or do we let the lawyers handle it? The dragon's laughter was like distant thunder. Finish it, young blacksmith. Some chains are meant to be broken, regardless of the consequences. Brought the hammer down one final time. The joint cracked, stressed beyond its breaking point, and the last chain fell away with a crash that shook the entire station. The dragon's form blazed with ancient power as the containment field collapsed, energy patterns dancing across its scales like aurora. The creature slowly unfolded its wings, stretching muscles that had been bound for 15 years. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of ages, but also something new, gratitude. I am free, it said simply, and I will not forget the young species that preserved the ancient ways when all others had abandoned them. The officer made one last desperate attempt to restore the containment field, but the station's systems were overloaded by the dragon's presence. Screens flickered and died as the creature's bioelectric field interfaced with the alien technology in ways its designers had never anticipated. You have doomed us all, the officer said, his voice bitter with defeat. No, the dragon replied, its form already beginning to fade as it prepared to phase out of normal space. I have given you an opportunity to learn. The galaxy has forgotten that some things are more important than profit, that some knowledge cannot be reduced to data, that some beings deserve respect regardless of their economic value. The creature turned its ancient gaze to one final time. "Thank you, young blacksmith. You have given me more than freedom. You have given me hope that wisdom is not dead in this galaxy." "What will you do now?" asked. "I will travel," the dragon replied. "I will observe, and perhaps I will teach those willing to learn that the old ways and the new ways need not be enemies. There is room in this galaxy for both efficiency and craftsmanship, for progress and preservation." The dragon's form became translucent, existing partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human science could barely comprehend. "And I will remember that when all the advanced civilizations of this galaxy failed to see my suffering, it was a human with a hammer who chose to act." With that, the dragon faded from view, leaving behind only empty chains and the lingering sense of ancient presence. The station's systems slowly began to recover, but knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. As Counselor Stone began the formal process of shutting down the extraction facility and charging corporation with crimes against sapient life, gathered his tools, and prepared to return to Earth. He had accomplished something unprecedented, but he was looking forward to returning to his quiet workshop and the familiar rhythm of hammer on anvil. Sarah said as they prepared to leave the station, "Do you realize what you've done? You've changed everything. The dragon's freedom will reshape galactic politics for generations." Shouldered his tool bag and smiled. "I just did what my grandfather taught me to do. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones. Sometimes you have to use a hammer when everyone else is reaching for a computer." As they walked through the corridors toward the docking bay, reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, his biggest concern had been whether he had enough coal for the winter. Now he was part of a galactic incident that would be studied by historians for centuries to come. But in the end, it came down to the same principles his family had always followed: respect for craftsmanship, understanding of materials, and the knowledge that some things were more important than profit. The galaxy might be vast and full of wonders, but the fundamentals of decent behavior remained the same whether you were working with iron or whether your workshop was in Colorado or orbiting an alien star. The dragon was free, and Blacksmith had played a part in something larger than himself while never forgetting who he was or where he came from. It was, he thought, exactly what his grandfather would have wanted. 6 months after the liberation of the dragon from the station, the galaxy had not collapsed into chaos as many had predicted. Instead, something far more interesting was happening. Stood in his workshop, now expanded to include a section dedicated to what the galactic media had dubbed quantum metallurgy. The term made him smile every time he heard it. His grandfather would have called it knowing your materials and respecting your tools, but the alien scientists needed their fancy names for everything. The changes had started small. A week after the rescue mission, a ship had landed in the field behind his shop. Not a human vessel, but something elegant and organic-looking that seemed to have been grown rather than built. From it had emerged a delegation of beings he had never seen before, tall, graceful creatures with silver skin that reflected light like polished metal. They had introduced themselves as the Architects, one of the oldest known civilizations in the galaxy. "We have heard what you accomplished," their leader had said, speaking through a translation device that rendered their harmonic voice into something resembling human speech. "We wish to learn from your methods." Had been skeptical at first. The Architects were known throughout the galaxy for their advanced technology and their ability to manipulate matter at the quantum level. What could they possibly want to learn from a human blacksmith working with traditional tools? The answer, it turned out, was everything. "Your techniques incorporate principles we had forgotten," the architect explained as demonstrated the process of reading stress patterns in heated metal. "We have become so focused on molecular precision that we lost sight of the larger structures, the way forces flow through materials over time." It wasn't just the Architects. Word of the dragon's liberation had spread through the galaxy's underground networks, carried by traders and explorers who operated on the margins of official space. Within weeks, was receiving visitors from dozens of species, all seeking to understand how human metallurgy had succeeded where advanced alien technology had failed. They were the second to arrive, their crystalline forms reflecting the light of the forge fire as they watched work. They were master manipulators of silicon and carbon, capable of growing diamond structures with their bare hands. But they had never learned to work with traditional metals, dismissing iron and steel as primitive materials. "Show us," their speaker had requested, "how you see the soul of the metal." Had tried to explain that it wasn't mystical, just a matter of understanding how materials behaved under stress. But as he worked, heating and shaping a piece of steel while he observed, he began to realize that perhaps there was something more to what he did than simple technique. The steel sang under his hammer, each blow creating vibrations that traveled through the metal in complex patterns. They could see these patterns with their crystalline senses, watching as guided the flow of stress and strain through deliberate strikes. What looked random to most observers was actually a carefully orchestrated process, each hammer blow building on the last to create structures that were stronger than the sum of their parts. "You work with the natural properties of the material," the speaker observed. "You do not impose your will upon it, but rather guide it toward its ideal form." "That's exactly right," replied, surprised by how well the alien had understood. "Iron wants to be strong, my job is just to help it get there." Word of these sessions had reached the Galactic Council, and soon found himself at the center of a much larger phenomenon. The Council's Department of Technological Exchange had established a formal program to study traditional fabrication techniques, with as its primary instructor. Scientists and engineers from across the galaxy were arriving on Earth to learn about blacksmithing, woodworking, pottery, and other crafts that had been largely abandoned by most spacefaring civilizations. But it was more than just academic interest. The liberation of the dragon had revealed fundamental flaws in how galactic civilization approached technology and sapience. The corporations' crimes had been possible because their advanced extraction methods had become so divorced from their consequences that the suffering they caused was literally invisible to their instruments. "We have created a civilization of specialists," explained Doctor, the human who had been assigned to coordinate the exchange program. "Each species has developed incredible expertise in narrow fields, but we've lost the kind of broad, intuitive understanding that traditional crafts require." Had been reluctant to take on such a large role. He was a blacksmith, not a teacher, and certainly not a galactic ambassador. But as more visitors arrived and he saw their genuine desire to learn, he began to understand that he was preserving something important. The dragon had visited him once since the liberation, appearing in his workshop without warning during a particularly busy week. Its presence had sent his alien students into various states of excitement, fear, and reverence, but the ancient creature had focused entirely on. "You have begun something significant," the dragon had said, its voice carrying harmonics that made the metal tools in the workshop ring sympathetically. "These beings seek to reconnect with knowledge their ancestors once possessed." "I'm just teaching metalworking," had protested. "You are teaching them to see," the dragon had replied. "To understand that intelligence without wisdom is dangerous, that efficiency without compassion leads to atrocity." The dragon had spent several hours observing lessons, watching as alien scientists struggled to understand the relationship between heat, metal, and force. When a young engineer had become frustrated with his inability to properly read the color of heated steel, the dragon had intervened. "Your people see only data," the dragon had said to the young, its voice gentle despite the obvious tension the alien felt in its presence. "But this human sees stories. Each change in color tells him something about the metal's history, its current state, its potential future. Learn to see the stories and the data will follow." The exchange had led to one of the most significant breakthroughs of the program. The engineer, working with over several weeks, had developed a new class of materials that combined molecular precision with traditional grain structures. The resulting alloys were stronger and more versatile than anything either species had created independently. But the real revolution was philosophical rather than technical. The galaxy's major powers were beginning to question assumptions that had guided their development for. The idea that newer was always better, that efficiency justified any cost, that intelligence could be measured purely through technological capability. All of these beliefs were being in the wake of the dragon's liberation. The Galactic Council had established a new department dedicated to what they called wisdom archaeology, the systematic study of knowledge and practices that advanced civilizations had abandoned. Teams of researchers were exploring dead worlds and abandoned colonies, searching for traces of traditional crafts and philosophies that might have been lost to progress. They were finding more than anyone had expected. On 186F, researchers discovered the remnants of a civilization that had achieved faster-than-light travel using methods based on organic growth rather than mechanical engineering. Their ships had been grown like plants, with hulls that could self-repair and adapt to different environments. The civilization had vanished thousands of years ago, but their techniques were being studied by biological engineers throughout the galaxy. The ruins on 581G revealed a society that had developed quantum computing using crystalline structures similar to those created by but incorporating principles that the modern had forgotten. These ancient computers had been capable of processing information in ways that seemed impossible by current standards, treating data as a living system rather than static information. Most intriguing of all were the findings from Wolf 359b, where had uncovered evidence of a species that had achieved a form of collective consciousness through traditional storytelling techniques. Their oral traditions had contained embedded mathematical structures that allowed them to share complex scientific knowledge without any written records or electronic devices. "We're discovering that there are many paths to advanced civilization," Doctor explained during one of their regular briefings. "The model that most galactic species have followed, rapid technological development followed by abandonment of traditional knowledge, is just one approach, and maybe not the best one." Found himself at the center of these discussions, despite his continued protests that he was just a blacksmith. His workshop had become an unofficial embassy for the Wisdom Archaeology Project, a place where ancient techniques were preserved and studied by beings from across the galaxy. The irony wasn't lost on him. Earth, which had been largely ignored by galactic civilization as a backward world clinging to obsolete practices, was now seen as a treasure trove of preserved knowledge. The handful of humans who had refused to join the galactic exodus were suddenly among the most valuable people in known space. But it wasn't just humans who possessed traditional knowledge. The research teams were discovering that every species had abandoned valuable techniques in their rush toward technological advancement. The challenge was finding people who still remembered the old ways. That's where the dragon came in. As one of the oldest known beings in the galaxy, the dragon possessed memories that spanned millions of years. It had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, watching as each one made the same fundamental mistakes. In the months following its liberation, the dragon had begun sharing some of these memories with researchers, offering glimpses of techniques and philosophies that had been lost to time. "The pattern is always the same," the dragon explained during one of its visits to its workshop. "A young species discovers technology and becomes intoxicated by its power. They begin to believe that their tools can solve any problem, answer any question. They abandon the wisdom of their ancestors in favor of the efficiency of their machines." "But efficiency isn't necessarily bad," pointed out. "Some of these new techniques are genuinely better than the old ones." "True," the dragon agreed. "But wisdom lies in knowing when to use which approach. Your people have preserved both the ancient knowledge and the ability to adapt it to new challenges. You understand that sometimes the oldest solution is the best solution, but you're not afraid to combine it with newer techniques when appropriate." This philosophy of balanced integration was becoming the foundation of a new approach to galactic development. Instead of abandoning traditional knowledge in favor of advanced technology, species were learning to combine the best of both worlds. The architects had developed new construction techniques that combined their quantum matter manipulation with traditional architectural principles discovered in the ruins of dozen dead civilizations. Their latest projects were buildings that were both more efficient and more beautiful than anything they had created before, structures that seemed to grow naturally from their surroundings while incorporating advanced technology seamlessly. They had revolutionized their crystal growing techniques by studying the oral traditions of extinct species that had worked with living stone. Their new crystals were not just functional, but possessed an aesthetic quality that their previous work had lacked, each one unique and beautiful while serving its technical purpose perfectly. Even the, chastened by the exposure of their crimes against the dragon, were working to reform their approach to resource extraction. They had partnered with traditional craftsmen from multiple species to develop harvesting techniques that worked with natural processes rather than against them. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy approached the question of sapience itself. The dragon's liberation had forced a fundamental re-examination of what it meant to be intelligent, what rights sentient beings possessed, and how advanced civilizations should treat those they encountered. The old standards had been based purely on technological capability. If a species could build starships and manipulate quantum fields, they were considered advanced and worthy of respect. If they worked with stone tools and lived in harmony with their environment, they were considered primitive and fair game for exploitation. The dragon's case had shattered these assumptions. Here was a being of incredible ancient wisdom and power that had been dismissed as a non-sapient biological resource because it didn't fit the galaxy's narrow definition of intelligence. How many other beings had been similarly overlooked or exploited? A new department within the Galactic Council, the Sapience Recognition Authority, was working to develop broader criteria for identifying and protecting intelligent life. Instead of focusing solely on technological markers, they were looking at creativity, problem-solving ability, emotional complexity, and the capacity for growth and learning. Their preliminary surveys had already identified dozens of species that had been misclassified, beings whose intelligence took forms that conventional testing hadn't recognized. Some communicated through chemical signals that created complex philosophical discussions. Others stored their consciousness in crystalline matrices that could survive for millions of years. Still others existed as collective entities where individual identity was less important than group wisdom. Had been asked to serve on the authority's advisory board, a role he had accepted with considerable reluctance. His contribution was unique. As someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of stress and structure in materials, he had developed an intuitive understanding of patterns and systems that proved valuable when evaluating non-standard forms of intelligence. "You see connections that others miss," explained Dr. Sarah, no relation to despite the shared surname, who headed the authority's research division. "Your work with metals has taught you to recognize complex systems in ways that our standard analytical tools can't match." It was during one of these evaluation sessions that encountered something that would change his understanding of intelligence forever. The subject was a cloud of metallic particles discovered orbiting a neutron star in the Vega system. Initial surveys had classified it as an unusual but non-living phenomenon, probably debris from an ancient space battle. But closer observation had revealed patterns in the cloud's movement that suggested purposeful behavior. The particles, each one no larger than a grain of sand, moved in complex formations that conventional physics. They seemed to communicate with each other through electromagnetic pulses, creating waves of information that flowed through the cloud like thoughts through a brain. "We think it might be a form of distributed consciousness," Doctor explained as they watched recordings of the cloud's behavior. "Each particle is like a neuron, and the cloud as a whole might represent a single thinking entity." Studied the patterns, watching how the particles flowed and shifted in response to external stimuli. There was something familiar about the movement, something that reminded him of the way stress patterns traveled through heated metal. "Can you communicate with it?" he asked. "We've tried standard first contact protocols, but there's been no response. If it is intelligent, it doesn't recognize our attempts at communication." Thought for a moment, remembering his conversations with the dragon and the way the ancient being had shown him new ways to see familiar patterns. "What if it doesn't communicate with words or symbols?" he suggested. "What if it communicates through structure and flow, the way metal communicates with a blacksmith?" The idea seemed far-fetched, but Doctor was willing to try anything. Using the authority's most advanced sensors, they began transmitting structural patterns toward the cloud mathematical sequences expressed as geometric formations, stress patterns translated into electromagnetic frequencies. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The cloud erupted into complex patterns of movement, particles dancing in formations that created three-dimensional sculptures of incredible beauty and complexity. The electromagnetic emissions intensified, creating harmonics that reminded of the way the dragon's voice made metal tools ring in sympathy. It took weeks to establish even basic communication, but eventually they managed to exchange simple concepts. The entity, which called itself something that translated roughly as the flow of understanding, had been aware and thinking for thousands of years. It had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, observed the birth and death of stars, but had never encountered another form of consciousness that could perceive its existence. The flow of understanding was, it turned out, a master of what it called structural philosophy, Its thoughts were expressed through the arrangement and movement of its component particles, creating physical metaphors for abstract concepts. It could demonstrate mathematical principles by arranging itself into geometric forms, express emotions through color and rhythm, and share memories by recreating the patterns of events it had witnessed. "This changes everything," Doctor whispered as they watched the entity demonstrate its understanding of quantum mechanics by arranging its particles into a perfect scale model of atomic structure. "Intelligence doesn't require biology. It doesn't require individual consciousness. It doesn't even require matter in the way we understand it." The discovery of the flow of understanding was just the beginning. Once researchers knew what to look for, they began finding evidence of non-standard intelligence throughout the galaxy. Gas giant atmospheres that showed signs of complex chemical thinking. Asteroid fields that moved in patterns suggesting group intelligence. Even star systems where the orbital mechanics had been subtly altered to create vast clockwork computers. The galaxy was full of minds, but most of them thought in ways so different from biological consciousness that they had been invisible to conventional science. Found himself at the center of these discoveries, his unique ability to read patterns and structures making him invaluable to the research teams. But the work was challenging in ways he hadn't expected. "Every time we discover a new form of intelligence, we have to question our assumptions about consciousness itself," he explained to Sarah during one of their regular video calls. "I thought I was just learning to work with metal, but it turns out I was learning to recognize patterns of organization that exist throughout the universe." The philosophical implications were staggering. If intelligence could exist in forms as varied as crystalline matrices, particle clouds, and planetary ecosystems, then consciousness might be one of the fundamental properties of the universe itself. Perhaps mind was not something that emerged from matter, but something that was inherent in the structure of reality. The dragon had hinted at this during its last visit, speaking of consciousness as a force that shaped reality rather than simply observing it. "What you call intelligence is simply the universe becoming aware of itself," the ancient being had said. "Every pattern, every structure, every relationship between things, these are all expressions of cosmic consciousness learning to think." It was a humbling thought for someone who had started out just trying to preserve his family's blacksmithing traditions. But as stood in his workshop, surrounded by tools that had been used by generations of craftsmen, he began to understand that perhaps this had always been the true purpose of traditional knowledge. The old crafts weren't just about making useful objects. They were about learning to see the patterns that connected all things, understanding the relationships between matter and energy, force and form, intention and result. They were about developing the kind of intuitive wisdom that could recognize intelligence wherever it existed, in whatever form it took. The galaxy was waking up to the presence of minds it had never known existed, and it was a human blacksmith who was teaching them how to see. 2 years had passed since the liberation of the dragon, and found himself standing before the largest gathering of sapient beings in galactic history. Representatives from over 300 species filled the vast amphitheater of the new galactic assembly, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of intelligence that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The assembly itself was a marvel of collaborative engineering. Built on a neutral world in the galactic core, it had been designed using principles gathered from dozens of traditional architectural traditions. The architect's quantum manipulation techniques had shaped the basic structure, but crystal growing had created the acoustic systems, human stonework had provided the foundation, and biomechanical integration had made the whole structure alive and responsive. Most remarkably, the building could accommodate forms of intelligence that had no physical bodies at all. The flow of understanding participated through a carefully maintained electromagnetic field that allowed its particle consciousness to exist within the assembly's walls. Other discoveries from the Wisdom Archaeology Project had resulted in even more exotic forms of representation. The singing forest of Bee attended through harmonically encoded transmissions, while the theoretical mathematics collective from the Andromeda border existed as pure information patterns projected into specially designed computational matrices. Sat in the section reserved for the Human Preservation Council, a body that had been created to coordinate Earth's unexpected role as keeper of the galaxy's forgotten knowledge. To his left sat his grandfather's old apprentice, now a master craftsman in his own right. To his right was Doctor, who had become something of a celebrity for her work documenting traditional knowledge systems. But all eyes in the amphitheater were focused on the central platform, where the dragon rested in its full, magnificent glory. The ancient being had agreed to address the assembly, though it had insisted that be present as a witness to the proceedings. "I come before you not as a representative of any single species or civilization," the dragon began, its voice carrying harmonics that translated perfectly through the assembly's universal communication system. "I speak as one who has watched the rise and fall of countless societies, who has seen the patterns of growth and decline repeat across millions of years." The amphitheater was silent, except for the soft sounds of various beings adjusting their attention mechanisms. Even species that communicated primarily through chemical signals had gone still, their scent organs focused entirely on the dragon's words. "For too long, this galaxy has measured worth through the narrow lens of technological achievement. We have created a hierarchy of civilizations based on their ability to manipulate matter and energy, treating this as the sole measure of intelligence and value. This approach has led us to dismiss countless forms of wisdom and to exploit beings whose consciousness takes forms we do not immediately recognize." The dragon's gaze swept across the assembled representatives, lingering for a moment on the delegation. Several of the beings shifted uncomfortably, their biomechanical augmentations clicking with nervous energy. "The human who freed me from captivity possessed no advanced technology. His tools were ancient, his methods primitive by the standards of galactic civilization. Yet he succeeded where all the galaxy's advanced sciences had failed. How is this possible?" Felt hundreds of eyes and other sensory organs turned toward him. He had been dreading this moment, knowing that the dragon intended to use him as an example, but uncomfortable with being the focus of galactic attention. "The answer," the dragon continued, "lies not in the superiority of any particular technique, but in the wisdom that comes from understanding the connections between all things. Succeeded because he had learned to see patterns that others overlooked, to recognize the stories that materials tell about their nature and history." The dragon's form shimmered slightly as it shifted into what had learned was its teaching posture. Wings slightly spread to create geometric patterns that helped focus attention. "This ability to see connections, to understand systems as wholes rather than collections of parts, is what I call integral wisdom. It is the knowledge that emerges when technical skill is combined with deep understanding of natural patterns, when innovation builds upon tradition rather than replacing it." A representative of the architects raised one of its metallic appendages, requesting permission to speak. The dragon gestured acknowledgement, and the being's harmonic voice filled the amphitheater. "Honored Ancient, we have studied the human techniques extensively. While we acknowledge their effectiveness, we question whether such approaches can be systematically taught or integrated into existing educational frameworks. Is this integral wisdom something that can be deliberately cultivated, or is it simply an accident of cultural preservation?" The dragon's laugh was like distant thunder, warm and amused. "An excellent question, and one that goes to the heart of why we have assembled here today. The answer is both complex and simple." The ancient being paused, allowing the assembly's translation systems to catch up with the subtle harmonics of its communication. "Integral wisdom cannot be downloaded like data or manufactured like technology. It emerges from the relationship between knowledge and experience, between understanding principles and working directly with materials. It requires patience, humility, and the willingness to let things be what they are rather than forcing them to conform to predetermined concepts." Found himself nodding along with the dragon's words, remembering his grandfather's constant emphasis on listening to what the metal wanted to become rather than imposing his will upon it. "However," the dragon continued, "it can be cultivated through deliberate practice and careful teaching. The key is to create learning environments that honor both innovation and tradition, that value efficiency without losing sight of wisdom." Doctor leaned forward in her seat, her eyes bright with the intensity that always appeared when she encountered new ideas about knowledge preservation. "The Wisdom Archaeology Project has identified 17 distinct approaches to integral education among the galaxy's extinct civilizations," the dragon said, as if reading her thoughts. "Each represents a different way of balancing technical training with wisdom cultivation. Some focused on apprenticeship systems that passed knowledge directly from master to student. Others developed communal learning environments where entire communities participated in the education process. The theoretical mathematics collective pulsed with information patterns that the assembly's systems translated as intense curiosity. Most interesting of all were the societies that developed what they called living curricula educational systems that evolved continuously based on the changing needs of their students and their environment. These civilizations understood that wisdom could not be standardized, that each learner needed to develop their own unique relationship with knowledge. A new voice entered the discussion, the harmonic tones of the singing forest, transmitted across vast distances and somehow made tangible within the assembly hall. We have experienced this principle in our own growth patterns, the forest communicated. Each generation of our consciousness develops differently, shaped by the specific conditions of its time while maintaining connection to the root knowledge of our ancestors. The dragon turned its attention toward the source of the forest's voice. Yes, and your experience points to one of the most important aspects of integral wisdom. It must be alive and growing to remain valid. Knowledge that becomes fossilized, that stops adapting to new circumstances, eventually becomes useless regardless of how advanced it once was. This comment caused a stir among several delegations. The representative stood, his biomechanical enhancements whirring as they translated his agitation into diplomatic protocols. Are you suggesting that our scientific methods are somehow inferior, that our pursuit of objective, replicable knowledge is misguided? The dragon's response was gentle but firm. I am suggesting that objective knowledge without subjective wisdom is incomplete. You have created marvelous technologies, achieved incredible precision in your understanding of physical laws, but you lost the ability to recognize intelligence that doesn't think like you do. You became so focused on measuring and categorizing that you forgot how to simply observe and appreciate. Remembered his first encounter with engineering, the chains that had bound the dragon. Technically perfect, molecularly precise, but blind to the patterns that any traditional blacksmith would have recognized as weak points. Your people excel at analysis, the dragon continued, but analysis alone is insufficient. To achieve true understanding, you must also develop synthesis, the ability to see how parts relate to wholes, how individual components create emergent properties that cannot be predicted from their separate characteristics. The flow of understanding pulsed with electromagnetic patterns that conveyed what felt like agreement mixed with curiosity. Its particle cloud shifted into new configurations, creating three-dimensional mathematical sculptures that illustrated the dragon's concepts. The human blacksmith succeeded not because his tools were better than yours, but because his training had taught him to perceive patterns at multiple levels simultaneously. He could see the molecular structure of the metal, yes, but also its grain patterns, its stress distributions, its thermal history. Most importantly, he could see how all these factors worked together to create the material's overall behavior. Doctor raised her hand, and the dragon acknowledged her with a slight nod. You speak of integration as if it's a skill that can be learned, she said, but our research suggests that traditional knowledge systems often require cultural contexts that may be impossible to recreate. How do we preserve integral wisdom in a galaxy where most civilizations have already abandoned their traditional practices? An astute observation, the dragon replied. And the answer lies not in trying to recreate the past, but in creating new traditions that honor the principles of integral wisdom while addressing contemporary challenges. The ancient being's form began to glow with soft patterns of light, each pulse synchronized with its words in a way that made meaning flow through visual as well as auditory channels. Consider what has happened here on this world where the assembly meets. Engineers from dozens of species work together to create this structure, each contributing their unique expertise while learning from the others. The architects provided quantum manipulation techniques, but they learned about acoustic engineering from the contributed biomechanical systems, but they discovered new approaches to material stress by studying human stonework. Could see delegates throughout the amphitheater looking around at the building with new appreciation, recognizing it not just as a meeting place, but as a demonstration of the principles being discussed. This building represents a new kind of tradition, one that honors the wisdom of the past while creating something unprecedented. The techniques used here will be passed down to future generations, but they will also continue to evolve as new species contribute their own knowledge and perspective. The dragon's attention turned back, too, and the ancient being's next words carried a weight of significance that made the entire assembly lean forward. The liberation of my physical form was only the beginning of what the young blacksmith accomplished. By preserving traditional knowledge and demonstrating its continued relevance, he provided a bridge between the galaxy's past and its future. He showed us that wisdom and innovation need not be enemies, that the oldest solutions and the technologies can work together to create possibilities that neither could achieve alone. Felt the weight of hundreds of gazes upon him, but also something else, a sense of connection that seemed to flow through the assembly like a living thing. He realized that he was no longer just a blacksmith from Earth, but part of something much larger. Which brings us, the dragon continued, to the reason we have gathered here today. The Galactic Council has proposed the establishment of the Institute for Integral Wisdom, an institution dedicated to preserving traditional knowledge while fostering innovation that builds upon rather than replaces ancient understanding. This was news, too, though he could see from the expressions around him that many of the delegates had been expecting this announcement. Doctor was practically vibrating with excitement, while the representatives from various traditional knowledge-keeping species were exchanging what looked like satisfied glances. The Institute would serve multiple functions, the dragon explained. It would preserve endangered knowledge systems, teach integral wisdom principles to new generations, and foster collaboration between traditional craftspeople and advanced scientists. Most importantly, it would work to ensure that the galaxy never again makes the mistake of dismissing intelligence simply because it takes unfamiliar forms. The theoretical mathematics collective pulsed with information patterns that translated as a complex question about implementation methodologies and resource allocation. The dragon's response carried harmonics of amusement. The practical details will be worked out by beings far more suited to such tasks than I am. But the essential principle is simple. The Institute must itself embody the integral wisdom it seeks to preserve. It cannot be organized according to purely technological criteria or traditional academic hierarchies. Instead, it must create new forms of collaboration that honor both efficiency and wisdom. Found himself thinking about his grandfather's old workshop, about the generations of knowledge embedded in its tools and techniques. The idea of creating something similar on a galactic scale was both exciting and daunting. The singing forest's harmonic voice filled the amphitheater again. We offer our world as a potential site for such an institute. Our consciousness exists across multiple dimensions, allowing us to perceive patterns that purely physical beings might miss. We could provide unique insights into the development of integral wisdom. Other offers followed quickly. The architects volunteered their quantum manipulation expertise for the construction of research facilities. The promise to contribute their crystal-growing techniques for creating living archives that could preserve knowledge for millions of years. Even the clearly eager to rehabilitate their reputation after the Dragon incident offered their biomechanical integration technologies for creating learning environments that could adapt to the needs of different species. But it was the flow of understanding that made perhaps the most significant contribution. The particle entity reorganized itself into a complex geometric pattern that somehow conveyed vast amounts of information directly to the minds of the assembled delegates. Felt the knowledge flowing into his consciousness, not as words or images, but as pure understanding of possibilities he had never imagined. I offer the accumulated observations of my existence, the entity communicated. For thousands of years, I have watched the rise and fall of civilizations, studying the patterns that lead to wisdom or to folly. This knowledge could serve as a foundation for understanding how integral wisdom develops across different contexts and time scales. The dragon's approval radiated through the amphitheater like warm sunlight. And so we see the first principle of integral wisdom in action. Each contributor offers what they uniquely can provide, while learning from what others bring to the collaboration. The formal proceedings continued for several more hours, with various species offering resources, expertise, and commitments to the proposed institute, but found his attention drawn to the subtle interactions happening beneath the official discussions. Representatives from species that had never worked together before were finding common ground in their shared commitment to preserving wisdom. Ancient rivals were discovering that their different approaches to similar problems could complement rather than compete with each other. The assembly was becoming something more than just a meeting. It was transforming into a living demonstration of the principles it was discussing. As the session drew to a close, the dragon made one final observation that would resonate through galactic civilization for generations to come. "We stand at a crossroads," the ancient being said, its voice carrying harmonics of both warning and hope. "The galaxy can continue down the path of pure technological advancement, treating consciousness as a commodity and wisdom as an obsolete concept. Or it can choose a different future, one where innovation builds upon tradition, where efficiency serves wisdom rather than replacing it." The dragon's gaze found one last time, and in those ancient eyes the blacksmith saw a reflection of his own journey from simple craftsman to galactic catalyst. "The choice belongs to all of us, but the example has been set. A human with a hammer showed us that the oldest solutions sometimes work better than the technologies. Not because old is always better than new, but because true wisdom knows when to use which approach." 6 months later, stood in the central workshop of the Institute for Integral Wisdom, watching as beings from across the galaxy worked side by side to master techniques their species had long forgotten. A young engineer was learning to read stress patterns in crystal lattices under the guidance of a master. An architect quantum manipulator was discovering how human pottery techniques could inform the shaping of matter at the molecular level. The flow of understanding was teaching a group of biological researchers how to recognize emergent consciousness in complex systems. The Institute had been established on a world in the galactic core, but its influence was spreading throughout known space. Similar workshops were being created on hundreds of worlds, each one adapted to local conditions while maintaining connection to the central principles of integral wisdom. The dragon had become a frequent visitor to the Institute, serving as an advisor and teacher to students who came from across the galaxy to learn. But it was clear that the ancient being's greatest satisfaction came not from formal recognition, but from seeing the principles it had long advocated finally taking root in galactic civilization. "You have started something that will outlive us all," the dragon said to during one of its visits. "The knowledge being preserved here, the connections being formed between different traditions, this will influence the development of consciousness throughout the galaxy for millions of years to come." Looked around the workshop, at the incredible diversity of minds working together to understand the patterns that connected all things. It was a far cry from his grandfather's forge, but in another sense it was exactly the same, a place where knowledge was preserved, shared, and transformed through the direct interaction between teacher and student, tradition and innovation. "I still can't believe it all started with breaking some chains," he said. The dragon's laughter carried harmonics of deep contentment. "You did much more than break chains, young blacksmith. You broke assumptions, challenged hierarchies, and opened minds to possibilities they had never considered. The physical chains were just the beginning." As returned to his work, teaching a mixed class of students how to recognize the voice of heated metal, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started out simply trying to preserve his family's traditions, never imagining that those traditions might hold keys to transforming galactic civilization. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that wisdom often came from the most unexpected places, carried by the most unlikely messengers. Sometimes it took a blacksmith to free a dragon, and sometimes it took freeing a dragon to teach the galaxy how to see. The hammer struck the anvil with practiced precision, sending sparks dancing through the workshop. Each blow carried not just the skill of generations of human craftsmen, but the accumulated wisdom of countless species learning to work together. In those sparks, could see the future of a galaxy where ancient knowledge and cutting-edge science walked hand in hand, where efficiency served wisdom, and where consciousness was honored wherever it was found. The dragon had been freed, but more importantly, the galaxy itself had been liberated from the narrow thinking that had trapped it for so long. And it had all started with a human who understood that sometimes the old ways worked better than the new ones, not because they were older, but because they were wiser. The work continued, the knowledge spread, and the patterns of integral wisdom slowly transformed the galaxy into something beautiful and unprecedented. A civilization that honored both its past and its future, where every form of consciousness was valued, and where the ancient art of seeing connections between all things guided the development of technologies that served life rather than exploiting it. In workshops across the galaxy, hammers struck anvils, crystal sang to crystal, and consciousness in all its myriad forms worked together to create a future that honored the wisdom of the ages while reaching boldly toward possibilities yet to be imagined. The dragon's liberation had become the galaxy's awakening, and Blacksmith had played his part in freeing not just one ancient being, but the unlimited potential of minds learning to work together across all the barriers that had once divided them.